Hi, my name is Catrone, and this is the defense presentation of my thesis. So the title of my thesis was Relational Training of Contextual Cues and Self-Rule Formation in Simulated Slot Machines. First, we're going to talk about a little bit on why people are, behaving this way, why people are interacting with slot machines, and then we'll go into like more complex, why people are, relating stimuli with different wins, winning streaks and whatnot, and we'll of course talk about the methods of my study and the discussion. So let's look at some general background information. Of all the money gambled, so this is table games, poker, other different types of casino games, stadium gambling, sports gambling, 44% of all that money from all those types of gambling go towards slot machines. So that right there is cause, for observation, especially in a field which observes people's behaviors and how the environmental factors play into those, either maintaining them, reinforcing them, and whatnot. So given that huge number, that is ridiculous, 44% of all that money, why? Why is this happening? So the first thing that we're going to look at is just it's easy to access. You obviously have casinos, but now, especially in America, it seems like a slightly newer thing. There's slot machines in gas stations. So, you're going to get your gas. Oh, there's a slot machine and it's very quick. I'll just play it right there. There's also slot machine apps on your tablet and iPhone. So this is really interesting because, now there's nothing really holding us back from doing this if you have one of these devices. So the response cost in order to go and do a slot machine is exceedingly low. So of the people that classify themselves as gamblers, or people that have gambled, 1 to 1.4% of them do it pathologically. So pathologically just meaning that it's impeding their life, just their daily routines and whatnot. So this is a huge area of research for behavior analysis and for mental health in general, that this is a very large number of people. So why is this happening? So let's look at just some environmental factors. You go into a casino, they pump it with oxygen so you're not getting sleepy. They give you drinks and they give you food. They want you to stay in that chair and keep spending money at their facility. You got this nice comfy chair. There's different like pay rates. You can either do like a penny, quarter, more. And so those things together just kind of keep people in their seat and draw people to slot machines. And the other aspect is when you win, that is really cool. There's a lot of lights, sounds, and neurologically, studies have shown that your palms are sweating, your heart is beating, your pupils dilate, your breathing gets faster, showing just genuine biological excitement over what is happening in front of you, over interacting with this machine. So that is, just a small part of explaining where that 44% of money is going. Another aspect is just the immediacy of results. So when you look at different types of gambling like fantasy football or horse racing or poker, it doesn't have that same immediacy that slot machines do. So on a slot machine, you pull a reel, 2 seconds later you find out whether or not you won or lost, and then you can play again. So let's say in a span of 5 minutes, you can play significantly more rounds in a slot machine than you can, let's say, poker, which takes time. You have a little bit more control over how much you bet. It could be 10, 15 minutes a round, whatnot. Or something like fantasy football. Like I myself sink $150 in every year for our annual fantasy football draft. And I won't know whether or not I'll get any of that money back until February, even though we did the draft in August. So the latency between when you bet and when you find the results is really long with games like that. But with slot machines, that's not the case. It is so quick. It's within a couple seconds and you find out whether or not you win. So that is, allowing more plays of this game in a smaller amount of time, kind of helping to perpetuate that. And if, as I was saying before, if you're sitting comfy and you're being fed, that's great. So another concept that is proposed, keeping people behaving this way, either like pathologically or just interacting with gambling machines and slot machines in general, is a loss disguised as a win, or LDW, or near misses. So a loss disguised as a win. I don't know if you can see this, but one now is higher, less weight than loss total. So let's say you put $50 into a machine, a slot machine, and then 5 attempts later, you win $30 back. Woo, that's great, you won 30 bucks. However, you're still down $20 from where you were before. So a slot machine doesn't differentially reinforce the amount of money that you win, right? So even in the same round, like if you put a bet in of $5 and you got $2 back, that's good that you won, but you're still losing money. Although the slot machine, either way, loss disguised as a win or a full win, it's not, it doesn't differentiate between those. So it still has the same amount of lights and sounds that it would in a loss disguised as a win as it would in a real win. So it's still creating that biological, excitement of your palms getting sweaty, your heart is beating fast, you're breathing faster, your pupils dilate. So people do not respond differently to losses disguised as wins and full wins, at least biologically. It still evokes that same reaction. Now, when we're looking at near misses, like let's say this is a 3-slot slot machine, here there's a triple and then 2 sevens. 2 sevens, so close, right? So you want to try to get that again. So what people are saying is, like, as you're moving forward with this and you get a near miss, the ratings of the probability that you will get that again, that you will hit a win after something like a near miss, is much greater, even though regardless of the topography of that individual or what the individual thinks, it's not going to change the probability of the win and loss ratio on a slot machine. So that kind of goes into this idea of gambler's fallacy and illusion of control. So the gambler's fallacy is, let's say you're in a casino, someone was sitting at the same chair for 25 minutes, and they were losing every single time, every single round, 25 minutes. And they get up, all of a sudden someone swoops in, sits in that chair, and presses that button. That person is thinking, the concept is that, it's got to hit soon. And if there's 25 losses, this next one is going to be a win, and I'm going to win all that person's money. So this also goes into, your own playing. If you're like losing, or winning, you might think you can control the probability or seeing some kind of pattern and reacting to it. So that kind of goes into the illusion of control. As I said before, slot machines have a set probability. You do not have any control, regardless of what you do, of whether or not you're going to win. So it's not like poker where you can play, different cards at the right times, or like fantasy football, where there's skill that goes in behind it, and you do have control over it. Slot machines, you have no control. So this gambler's fallacy and illusion of control just kind of play a part and to help perpetuate these gambling behaviors. So now let's look at just relating stimuli, another rule. So this first concept, relating stimuli and stimulus equivalence, was proposed by Murray Sidman. And he was just saying that you can relate one stimuli to another stimuli, and then essentially you can even relate functions to it. So let's look at that. So the first leg of this is reflexivity, and this is also known as identity matching. So let's say you've been given a penny, and in the field there's a penny, a quarter, and a dime. You're given the penny, you're expected to match the penny when the person says match the same. You're like, okay, you pick up the penny, you see the other penny, they're the same in form. So you match those, so A to A reflexivity. In symmetry, now this is A to B. So let's say now in the field, you have a bowl, a bathtub, and a coin slot. And this time you're given a penny. So you're taught, okay, match the same. Well, the expected response is matching the penny to the coin slot, and if that's reinforced, then you start relating these two stimuli, but it also goes the other way. So penny to slot, slot to penny. So if you were given a picture of a coin slot, and then out in the field was a toothbrush, a penny, and a toilet, you would match that coin slot to the coin because you have related these two in the same response class, in the same class together. Now transitivity kind of moves a little bit more it's a little more complex. So now you've already related the coin to the slot and the slot to the coin. So there's your reflexivity, or there's your symmetry. So between the coin and the slot and the coin is symmetry. And then you're also trained between the coin slot. When the coin slot is utilized, you activate the game, and it goes vice versa. So now you learn through symmetry that the coin to the slot and the slot to activating the game. But what's interesting is this relationship is formed here. Well, you have this coin, and you know that if it's related to slot and activating that slot activates the game, your coin activates the game. So this is that idea of transitivity between these two stimuli. They are now related. This coin will activate the game, and you realize that. So that's just kind of a quick review of Sidman's stimulus equivalence. So going a little bit further and kind of building off of that, there's this idea of relational frame theory. Now, this first one here, mutual entailment, is similar to symmetry in that, A to B, B to A. So the coin to the slot to the coin, and those are related. However, relational frame theory looks at things from a functional contextual approach of how people interact with the stimuli and the environment around them, and how that forms the way they behave. And this usually is related back to language, how people, and because that is how people generally interact with the world around them, is through some type of verbal behavior or whatever behavior. So relational frame theory kind of tries to explain the concepts behind that from a conceptual level. So after mutual entailment, there's combinatorial entailment. So this is similar to transitivity, but there's something to note here. So you train A to B, B to C, and in transitivity, obviously, you have the coin plays the machine. So you're like, this is great. You know that this coin can activate the machine. You don't have to teach this relationship, though. This is a derived relationship. So by teaching A to B and B to C, A to C is free. So that, when you're teaching someone, you just taught someone, this coin will activate the machine. And when you see the machine to activate it, you're like, what do I need to activate it? It's a coin. It's a derived response. So that kind of plays into this next slide of transformation. This picture here is not necessarily how the research shows it. This is just for illustration purposes. But in transformation, with that, essentially that derived relation, you can change the function of the stimulus. So before, a coin, it's more or less arbitrary. It's just a little flat piece of metal, but we place this concept onto it that it means money, it means, time in some sense. You have to work for it. So that coin has transformed into a mode to buy things, so like a round in a slot machine game. So another example would be like you see a dog and you think, great, in the past I've had good experiences with dogs. You go to pet this dog, they bite your hand. All of a sudden, after that incident, you want to stray away from other dogs because it's generalized that oh, this one dog bit me, so all dogs are going to bite me. That sucks. So this can kind of be related back to slot machines here, where like, well, I have this coin and this penny plays it. What if I put 25 cents in? So this kind of relates back to that gambler's fallacy and illusion of control, where like, okay, I have this way to play this game. How can we keep going, and how can I win? So along with that transformation of stimulus function is this idea of conditional discrimination. And there's 3 studies that relate conditional discrimination to slot machines. So the first one here is Lomke and Dixon 2006. And in their study, they started off with a baseline where there was 2 slot machines in the field. One slot machine was mostly yellow background on the slot machine skin, and the other slot machine was mostly blue. And this was done on Visual Basic just so it was a little bit easier to handle. So during baseline, people were able to choose whatever they wanted, and their choices were noted. In the second phase, they were trained that yellow was just more than in general. So how they did this was they had a sample stimulus in front. So let's say there was a penny again, and on the bottom there was 3 like comparison stimuli essentially. There was a penny, a nickel, and a quarter. And behind that, there was a rectangle, and the rectangle was either yellow or blue, just like the yellow or blue they saw on the baseline. So when it was yellow, they were expected to pick the thing that was more than. So if it was a penny, they would pick the quarter or the nickel because those are more. And if it was blue, they would pick the one that is less than. And they were, they weren't told this relationship, but they came in contact with the contingencies because the program was set up to give them a correct or incorrect response after that with chimes or a chord. So chimes for correct, chord for incorrect. And during their baseline, people were kind of picking randomly, and there really wasn't any set, preference for one machine or the other. However, after post-test, when the yellow was trained as more, people were more apt to pick that yellow. So that relationship between the yellow being more than and the slot machine was derived. They didn't have to teach that. So that is an amazing fact that through some simple procedure you can change someone's preference. So Kuhn, Diamond, Jackson, and Dixon kind of extended that, and what one of the differences that they did was instead of 3 stimuli out there, they did 2, because they said, well, if there's a 1, 5, and 20 as the comparison, and there's a 10 in the middle there, and you say, oh, pick the one that's less than, the 1 and the 5 are both correct answers, but the person might just pick the 1. So if that set comes up again, they're just going to pick the 1, so they're not learning all the relationships. So what Kuhn, Diamond, Jackson, and Dixon did was they just had 2 stimuli out there and just relating both of them. And instead of a rectangle behind the comparison stimuli, the screen skin in the background was yellow or blue. And their results replicated Zomke and Dixon. So moving forward, Nastali, Dixon, and Jackson, something that Kuhn et al. Noticed was Zomke and Dixon didn't look at pathological gamblers, and Kuhn et al. Didn't do that as well, but they took measures to see whether or not their participants had some kind of pathological gambling tendencies by doing the South Oaks gambling screen. And Nastali and Dixon and Jackson moved forward with that, and they had 2 groups. One group that was more prone to pathological gambling behaviors, and one group that wasn't. So the interesting difference between this study and these 2 studies was that during baseline, if someone was showing a preference for a color, let's say blue, then during the relational training, the code in the Visual Basic Programming was switched so that yellow, the opposite of the blue, was trained as more than. So that, in the past, in these studies here, if someone was, maybe moving towards, one color over the other, and then they were trained that that color was better, then they would just continue to choose that color. So it's interesting in this study that they just switched it. You want to be able to switch the preferences. That's the point of the study. So what's interesting about this is, more or less it replicated the results of the previous studies, but they noticed that with the gamblers, those who didn't move forward from that post-test, from that second test, were choosing what they chose in baseline. So that kind of falls into that gambler's fallacy of thinking that one stimulus is better, or you're testing a streak, or so that's just kind of that concept behind that, where maybe that the gamblers were just picking because they liked it and they were intermittently reinforced for it previously. So one thing that the studies mentioned as aspect for future studies is adding in this concept of self-rule. So just kind of talking out loud while they're picking their choices. So like, why did you pick the yellow one? Why did you pick the blue one? But these studies haven't specifically focused on that. First, before we go on, we're just going to talk a little bit about what self-rules are in general. So a self-rule, Skinner talks about verbal behavior being essentially like an interaction between someone. You talk, someone responds, there's a reinforcement structure right there, so then your talking is reinforced. However, you can also have verbal behavior within your skin and give yourself that own reinforcement, just thinking or reading to yourself. That was something he hypothesized. So that kind of falls under this self-rule idea, where you create these rules inside your skin and that affects the way you behave. So it's still rule-governed behavior, it's just you're the one creating the rules. So a problem in behavior analysis is these private events are not observable. So a lot of people just kind of discount them, which is an issue because these things are, this is a very important concept. So in previous research for self-rules, what Hayes, White, and Bissett did was they tried to formalize talking aloud. So talking aloud is essentially showing what those private events, vocalizing what their private events are so that you can observe them. And what they did was they had 3 controls to kind of help formalize that, because in behavior analysis, you have to, it's an observation and it's metrics. So the first one was, first control is the person is talking and it's not necessarily impeding the way they're reacting to a response. Let's say they're playing a piano and they're talking about playing with a piano, they're functionally similar. The second control is if they change their self-rule, will their function change? So let's say someone's playing a piano, like I'm playing Flight of the Bumblebee, and then they say, now I'm going to play Mozart. And that changes their behavior. Them talking out loud changes their behavior. And the third control is if they are talking out loud and someone else is in the room, will their rule change someone else's behavior who's doing the same function? So that is, if it falls under these 3 rules, you essentially can say that that person's vocalizations are private events and they are becoming these vocalized self-rules. So Arntzen, Haustrato did a similar study in the sense that they looked at these controls in kids, 2 participants that had autism and learning a computer skill. So one participant was doing a computer skill, they were talking out loud in a sort of task analysis way, and talking out loud was changing their own behavior. So that controlled for controls 1 and 2. For control 3, they had a second person looking and hearing what that person was saying, and that changed the second person's behavior. So it qualified under all 3 controls, and therefore, under this idea that Hayes et al. Talked about, it could be considered a self-rule. So going on, Fluen and Rayfeld did a similar study where they essentially taught a couple of participants who were disabled just daily living skills. And with little reinforcement, direct reinforcement, both kids were able to interact appropriately with these daily living skills. So, the first person was saying a task analysis, talking out loud, and the second person was reacting to what the first person was saying, the first person's self-rules. So they did not need to reinforce as much to create these concepts because of the self-rules that were being generated. And then the Wilson and Dixon study, kind of going along with that self-rule idea, but also replicating in some ways the Zomke and Dixon article, tried to look at how people are relating to an arbitrary stimuli in the first place. So they had 3 stimuli in their baseline, and they were asked, what do you think each one of them means? And then in the second relational phase, they tried to train that. And in the end, after the relational training and after, they're talking out loud and giving themselves a self-rule that, oh, red means more, silver means more, they were playing more silver coins and more red coins based on their relational training. So it's similar to the Zomke and Dixon article set, where one color started meaning more than and one color started meaning less than. So the present study was an attempt to try to combine all of these. So it's similar to the Zomke and Dixon articles and the Hoon articles in the sense of conditional discrimination with slot machines, but the present study was trying to look at those self-rules that are vocalized. So for the methods in the baseline, similar to previous studies, there were 2 slot machines, and you just picked between one or the other. So unlike the Zomke and Dixon articles, instead of color, I used arbitrary stimuli like in the Wilson and Dixon articles. So these switched, and they went through 50 trials of this. So one trial, this might be on one side, and it might be on the next side, the other trial, just to kind of control for a side bias. And after the 50 trials, not being reinforced by me, just by the machine. And again, this was also a 50% win-loss rate, so they won, half the time and they lost half the time. After the 50 trials, they moved on to relational training phase 1. So similar to the Who Net All articles, there was 2 sample stimuli out, and then instead of in the background, instead of the background being a color, I just showed the comparison stimuli as the arbitrary picture that I created and what is related to the slot machines. So when one popped up, you either had to choose the one that was more than or less than. So in this first testing phase, this double arrow one was trained as more than. And then after that, there was a slot machine post test, so it looked just like baseline. And this time, they were prompted to say out loud why they picked that machine. So let's say they clicked it, they won. Oh, cool, I won. I picked this machine because blank. And these were tested on 6 categories, essentially, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So after they were done with that, they went into the relational training and testing phase 2. Same thing, except the opposite picture was trained as more than now. And the post test was the same. So just like the other previous articles, they had to pass a criterion for training. So if they didn't hit 43 out of 48 correct trials, then they had to go through training again. And then in testing, there wasn't anything saying correct or wrong. They just went through it, and there was a strict criterion on that of just getting 48 out of 48, because it was suggested by Zlomke and Hoon that that will help solidify that relationship that, oh, this picture means more now, or the other picture means more now based on the training. So after they met criterion, they went through post phase 2. And the results. So we're just going to kind of look at this at one participant at a time. So generally, they didn't necessarily follow along with what the prior research said. So it didn't necessarily support some of the things that the other study is saying in terms of, oh, this picture was trained as more than, therefore their results showed that they were picking that slot machine that was associated with that picture more than the other one. So let's look one at a time. There we go. So look at this, there's a cumulative selection here over trial sets. So I just did trial sets of every 5, and this is over all 3 slot machines. So baseline, slot 1, and slot 2. So you can see in this first one, they were kind of evenly responding between both pictures, but then after the first training, all of a sudden they're responding more to the first picture than they were the second picture. So that could be more or less a replication of, Zlomke and Dixon, Hu, and Nestale. However, when it was reversed, they still picked the first one more than the second one. So what was interesting about this particular person was that in their pattern, one of the 6 things I looked at for vocal responses, any statement responding to pattern was noted. So, and they had 23 statements. So this person necessarily wasn't picking, especially during the second slot machine, they weren't picking one over the other because, saying out loud like, oh, I'm picking this one because it was more than this one, or this one won more or less. So they were going off of a pattern. And that relates to that gambler's fallacy and illusion of control, where they think that they have this pattern and they can figure out the winning ratio and like the winning pattern so they can get their credits back. So looking at the second one here, this person talked more about pattern and picture bias. So this again, kind of that illusion of control. They're trying to figure out what the pattern is, and then they also said that they really, really liked the second picture. So that's the one with the square and the circle, which wasn't always trained as more than. So you can kind of see in their responding that they just picked that second picture. They were following their own self-rule. They were saying, oh, I like this picture better. So they were responding to that in an appropriate way in that case. So although it didn't replicate the findings of Zonke and Dixon, when analyzing these two things together, you can see that sometimes, when their statements were more related to pattern or picture bias, it related to how they responded. So in this case, this person liked the second picture, and that one was picked more in both cases. Similar with the third one, third participant, they picked more related to statements about winning or losing. So they said, oh, I'm going to pick this one again because I won before, or I lost 3 times, I'm going to hit this one again. Totally falling under the gambler's fallacy. Participant 4 actually responded well to the relational training. So even response in baseline in slot 1, they started picking picture 1, which was trained as more than, and in slot 2, they picked picture 2 over picture 1 because picture 2 was trained as more than. So they did reverse their preferences. One interesting thing to note about participants 3 and 4 is I set a intervention criterion where if they went through the trainings 4 times and they didn't pass it on that 4th time, I would intervene and say, hey, what's going on? How's it going? And every single time I went for participant 3, and then when I went again for participant 4, they kept saying, I know that one picture is more than the other. I just keep making mistakes. So that's a little bit more anecdotal like anecdotal comments or whatnot. But it was interesting just to kind of see and hear that from that person. They are creating these relations through it's just taking a longer time to build on them. Now participant 5 picked picture 2 over picture 1 during all 3 phases. So they did not respond to the conditional discrimination tasks, especially in the first one. And her bias was towards one picture. So this is picture 2, she had a big bias towards. She just kept saying, I like this picture. This picture is good. And in addition to saying this picture is good or this picture is bad, when she said picture 2 was good, she was winning. Those times that she was winning and the probability fell in her favor, she was essentially being reinforced for her self-rule of saying, oh, I like this picture. Oh, look, I won. This is great. And it was interesting because in the second slot machine phase, she only picked picture 2 over picture 1 because she said, oh, now it was trained as better, so better or more than the other. So she followed her own self-rule that picture 2 was better, even though the probabilities were the same. So this was a pretty interesting study, just kind of seeing some different concepts and aspects behind the replication of these prior studies. And of course, there's limitations. So the first one that I want to talk about is it was kind of a homogeneous sample where most of the people had, most of them were men, most of them had college degrees. They did not have, on their SOC scores were very low. So there was either like 0 or 1, so there really wasn't, they were essentially all the same or very similar demographically. So future studies would look at it, just like with any limitation in a small subject design, they would just want to look at more participants from a wider range of demographics. The second one was vocal prompting. So in previous, sorry about that, in previous research, in self-rules, so there, a lot of work of Rayfeld was that there was a lot of prompting of talk aloud procedures. So just say it, say why you're doing what you're doing. And I feel like one limitation of my study was I didn't prompt that efficiently enough. So if the person didn't say out loud what they wanted, on a slot machine after they won or lost, the screen still went on to the next trial. So instead of waiting, like in previous studies, for that person to respond, it just went on. So their vocal responses were almost put on extinction in that sense because, there was no reinforcement for talking out loud. It was just my rule placed upon them saying, hey, say that. But, they just didn't, a lot of the participants just didn't talk on a lot of the trials. So that's something to kind of look into for future research. The other limitation was the sense of rewards. You know, the people weren't actually playing for anything. It was just credits on a machine, so they didn't get anything physical afterwards. It wasn't like they got money or course credit. They were just doing the subject just to do it. So future research would be good to look at if there were actually stakes. You know, like you give someone $5 worth of coins, and you tell them you can keep whatever you have in the end. So that might kind of elicit a different set of responses. In analyses, there was an analysis between cumulative selection and self-rules, but there wasn't any kind of analyses on winning streaks and how that affected performance. So future research would also just kind of benefit from doing that and looking more in depth through their analyses to see, in those vocalizations that you see here, like if they say side bias and you're looking at what they're picking, are they following along with what they're saying out loud? Is this based, compared against the winning streaks or losing streaks? So just some further analyses more in depth would be beneficial. And that's my references for the paper. So it has been a pleasure. This has been a great experience, and I hope you like it. And just let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you very much.